Alright, hello students. What we're going to talk about today is how we can actually use a good design and follow design principles to make sure that what we're doing in our custom Pong games is actually positioned to represent your work in the best situation possible. We've got a standard that we've been using, and the proportions and sizes that have been set up will make a big difference if you start to customize them. How many people out there are building the standard 640 by 480 version? About half of you. How many of you are working on I imagine the rest of you are working on a custom version. So let's talk about starting to change those things and some of the things you need to think about so that your gameplay and your design are following a good approach. You guys familiar with what a Rice Krispie treat is, I imagine? Making them's pretty simple. They only really have a couple of different ingredients. You know, you can use either the marshmallows or the minis, the Rice Krispies themselves, and some butter. It takes, they say, about 10 minutes of prep and 30 minutes start to finish to actually have them ready to eat. So if we made one of these, would we be able to serve the whole class with it? So we would end up with, 13 by 9 by 2 inch, 2 by 2 squares. I think we'd have less than one per person. Do you guys like Rice Krispie treats? What if we could change the recipe to serve more? How could we do that? Double? Well, I've been teaching high school long enough. I would probably do the math like this, and let's do this in a minute. I'm going to have you actually hit. I'm going to unlock your keyboards. I'm going to have you press start and type your calc. CALC will open up the calculator when you hit enter, and you can punch some numbers in here. But let's do some easy math in this example. If we took the 3, 1, and 4, and 6, which I'm getting from these numbers right here, and actually one of these would change, the other one wouldn't necessarily change because you're using one of those two ingredients. If I were to multiply them all by 10, that's pretty easy math. 3, 1, 4, 6 changes to 30, 10, 40, 60. So we would end up with a lot more Rice Krispie treats. Does it make sense? But we didn't just change one thing, we changed them all to the same proportion by a factor of 10 in this example. And so the consideration you have when you start to change things in your Pong game is to try to figure out what the proper proportions are. Good designs can be used as models in your work. Do you recognize either one of these two designs here? So which one do you recognize first? Maybe the Apple logo. Did you understand that there were certain proportions and scales that were predetermined on what the radius of the different circles were, how they were going to fit in? Did anybody know that? So that's actually done mathematically, and then the one on the right is actually a pretty famous design consideration. They find this a lot in nature. And this looks like the inside of a shell. They find it in the inside of seeds. And it almost is one of those things that's used as, there must be some kind of a grand design in hand here because this shows up throughout different types of creation. Nonetheless, it is mirrored and modeled in people's creations. This is an interesting movie that came out in 1999. Has anyone ever seen The Iron Giant? All right, you know, whether you like it or not, it's an old school animation film, so it wasn't done with CGI. They actually drew out the cells and colored them. And one of the things they had to consider was, if they're going to have this hero and they're going to have somebody who people can relate with, they wanted to have certain proportions, and so in their design documents you can see they've actually thought about how tall Hogarth is compared to the Iron Giant. In fact, I think they say that the Iron Giant is something like 13 and a half or 13 and a third Hogarths high. Kind of a wild way to look at things, and they also took into account how big would he be overall compared to things like a tank or the town, where you could see his head poking over the top of some buildings, or maybe an army jet. So the key point here is they considered how these things interrelate. And in the standard art, there are predetermined proportions. What are the major art elements we have in our ball and paddle style game? We have a couple of paddles that are ideally about the same size, a ball, and the background art. So let's think about this. Just like we talked about Hogarth with the Iron Giant, how many paddles tall is the screen? What is the proportion? So if we were to take 480 and divide it by 72, and you can use your calculator for something like this to figure out the proportion. Yeah, I've got that turned off right now. But what you'd find out is you'd end up with a value that's between 6 and 7. Ironically, the value is something like 6.66 with the bar over the top. So the point is that you want your paddle to take some amount of time and to fill some amount of space, and the designers for the standard art have decided that the proportion they have is somewhere between 6 and 7 paddles tall. How long does it take for the ball to cross from one side of the screen to the other? It does depend, but what speed do we set it at initially? 5. What does that 5 mean? Does anyone know? Yeah, it's the number of pixels per game loop. And how many game loops are there per second? Yeah, we're looking for 60 FPS, or 60 frames per second. So that's our target. We'll probably get it. And so if we did 5 times 60, can you do that math? How many pixels per second? 300. So to cross from left to right or right to left in a straight line, it'll take a little over 2 seconds. So we need to think, if we make our screen bigger and keep the ball at the same size, how that would affect how long it takes the ball to get from side to side. It might feel laggy, but we've just changed the proportions. The other consideration is straight line isn't necessarily the same as what will happen in gameplay. For example, in this path, we're not going straight 640. We're crossing pretty far in a vertical angle before we drop off at a reflected angle. We might hit the screen a couple, 3 different times in the way to reflect back, and it might actually take more along the lines of 5 or 7 seconds for the ball to return to play. The longer the distance, the longer the time. And so when you consider, if I'm putting a different size ball in, if I'm changing the size of the screen, if I'm changing the size of the racket, how should they proportionally relate? So if you upsize and customize your artwork, all those values should either match or you need to adjust the proportions. Now you could decide, I want my paddle to be covering more of the screen. You could decide, I want my ball to be smaller and be hard proportionately. Those are design considerations that you get to make as you are taking control of your own design. What I want you to remember doing is I want you to try things. I want you to experiment. That each of you can find a balance that you find is right. Just like Goldilocks and the 3 bears, she had to try a few to figure out which one she wanted. So what that amounts to is when you are testing your game, when you're designing your